In the summer of 1944, as American forces island-hopped their way across the Pacific, a team of Manhattan project planners and Army Air Forces strategists gathered around a map in a nondescript office thousands of miles from the front lines. They were searching for something that didn't yet exist, a launching pad for a weapon the world had never seen, a base from which to unleash atomic fire upon Japan. Their fingers traced lines across the vast blue expanse of ocean, calculating distances, measuring logistics, weighing the terrible arithmetic of war. They needed an island close enough to reach the Japanese mainland, large enough to support the massive infrastructure required, flat enough to accommodate the longest runways ever constructed, and secure enough to guard the most explosive secret in human history. Their search eventually settled on a small, sugar-shaped speck of coral and limestone in the Mariana Islands, a place that had changed hands between empires like currency, a forgotten territory that would soon become the most important 8 miles of Earth on the planet. The island was called Tinian. Tinian had lived many lives before the Americans arrived. The Spanish had claimed it centuries earlier, when conquistadors and missionaries carved the Pacific into provinces of God and gold. Then came the Germans, who purchased it as part of their late colonial ambitions, planting flags and establishing copper plantations among the palms. After the First World War, the Japanese inherited the Marianas under a League of Nations mandate, and Tinian became a land of sugarcane fields worked by Okinawan and Korean laborers, the green stalks rippling in the tropical wind beneath the shadow of Mount Lasso. The Japanese built towns with neat streets, planted gardens, and established a civilian population that went about the quiet business of farming and fishing, unaware that their peaceful island would become a fortress. When war erupted across the Pacific in December 1941, Tinian transformed. The Imperial Japanese Navy fortified the island with coastal guns, constructed airstrips, dug networks of caves and bunkers into the limestone cliffs, and garrisoned thousands of troops to defend this vital stepping stone between their empire and oblivion. The Americans came for Tinian in July 1944, and they came with overwhelming force. The battle was part of the broader campaign to seize the Marianas, and it followed the brutal, bloody conquest of nearby Saipan, where tens of thousands had died in savage fighting through jungles and mountains, where Japanese civilians had leaped from cliffsides rather than surrender, where the reality of total war had revealed itself in all its horrifying clarity. Tinian would be different, shorter, more surgical, though no less deadly. On the morning of July 24th, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions hit the northwestern beaches in a coordinated assault supported by naval bombardment and airstrikes that turned the sky orange and the sea white with spray. The Japanese defenders, under Colonel Kiyoshi Ogata, fought with the fanatical determination that characterized every island battle, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an American military machine that had learned hard lessons and perfected the lethal choreography of amphibious assault. The Marines pushed inland through sugarcane fields that provided deadly cover for snipers, cleared caves with flamethrowers and grenades, and methodically compressed the Japanese garrison into smaller and smaller pockets of resistance. On the night of July 31st, Colonel Ogata led what remained of his command in a final banzai charge, a desperate, suicidal assault that crashed against American lines in the darkness and broke like a wave against rock. By dawn, the island was in American hands. 9 days of fighting had cost nearly 400 American lives and virtually annihilated the Japanese garrison of 9,000 men. What followed next was nothing short of miraculous, a feat of engineering and construction that transformed Tinian from a battlefield into the busiest airport in the world in a matter of months. The Navy Seabees, the construction battalions whose motto "We build, we fight" became gospel across the Pacific. Arrived on ships loaded with bulldozers, graders, concrete mixers, steel, lumber, and the determination to reshape an island. They worked around the clock under the equatorial sun and through warm tropical nights, their machinery roaring, their muscles straining, their vision guided by blueprints that called for something unprecedented. They carved 4 massive runways into Tinian's plateau, each one more than 1.5 miles long, each one capable of handling the heaviest bombers in the American arsenal. They poured thousands of tons of concrete, erected Quonset huts and warehouses and fuel depots, installed power generators and communication systems, built roads with names borrowed from Manhattan, Broadway, 8th Avenue, 42nd Street, a touch of irony and homesickness that gave the jungle base a ghost of urban familiarity. By the end of 1944, Tinian had become the largest airbase in the world, home to hundreds of B-29 superfortresses that took off day and night to rain incendiary bombs on Japanese cities, each mission adding to the apocalyptic destruction that was turning Japan's urban centers into fields of ash and charred timber. But Tinian's most important role was yet to come. In the spring of 1945, as the war ground toward its bloody endgame, the 509th Composite Group arrived on the island under a veil of absolute secrecy. Commanded by Colonel Paul Tibbets, a veteran pilot with ice water in his veins and a mission unlike any in military history, the 509th was no ordinary bomber unit. Its personnel had been selected with extreme care, screened for reliability and discretion, trained at a remote base in Utah where they practiced dropping single bombs from high altitude, massive, ungainly bombs with oddly rounded shapes that looked nothing like conventional ordnance. The men of the 509th flew training missions over Tinian and nearby targets, perfecting their approach angles and release points, but they were forbidden from discussing their purpose even among themselves. Security agents from the Manhattan Project maintained constant surveillance. Armed guards surrounded certain hangars and bunkers. Rumor and speculation buzzed through the ranks like electrical current, but no one knew the truth, no one except a handful of scientists and military commanders who carried the weight of a terrible secret. The atomic bombs that could end the war, that could kill 100,000 people in a blinding instant, were being assembled right there on Tinian, in climate-controlled huts where physicists and technicians worked with materials that glowed faintly in the dark and could poison a man's bones. The bombs had names. Little Boy, a uranium gun-type device destined for Hiroshima. Fat Man, a plutonium implosion weapon bound for Nagasaki. Both represented the culmination of 3 years of frantic scientific effort, billions of dollars, and the most complex industrial undertaking in history. But in mid-July 1945, there was a problem. Little Boy was incomplete. Its enriched uranium core, the critical mass that would unleash nuclear fission and transform matter into energy according to Einstein's famous equation, had not yet arrived. Without it, the weapon was an expensive shell. The uranium existed, refined through the massive gaseous diffusion plants at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, purified and machined into components that together weighed just enough to go critical when fired together inside a gun barrel at thousands of feet per second. But getting it to Tinian presented enormous risks. It could not be flown, aircraft could be shot down, could crash, could disappear over the Pacific without trace. It needed to travel by ship, but which ship could be trusted with cargo that represented America's most vital secret? Cargo whose loss would delay the invasion of Japan and cost tens of thousands of lives? The choice fell upon the USS Indianapolis, a Portland-class heavy cruiser that had already written its name in the annals of naval history. Commissioned in 1932, the Indianapolis was a veteran of the Pacific War, bearing 9 battle stars from engagements at Attu, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. She had served as flagship for Admiral Raymond Spruance during critical battles, her 8-inch guns pounding Japanese positions, her crew fighting with distinction in every major campaign. In March 1945, off Okinawa, a Japanese kamikaze had found her, the suicide plane slamming into her stern in a fireball that killed 9 men and tore a gaping hole in her hull. The Indianapolis limped back to Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California for repairs, her crew grateful for the respite, eager to return to action but happy for the chance to sleep in real bunks, eat hot meals, and write letters home to families they hadn't seen in years. On July 14th, while the Indianapolis was still in port, Captain Charles Butler McVeigh III received extraordinary orders. McVeigh, a Naval Academy graduate from a distinguished military family, commanded the ship with quiet competence and the respect of his crew. The orders came from the highest levels, transmitted with an urgency that left no room for questions. The Indianapolis was to prepare for immediate departure on a top-secret mission. 2 days later, on the morning of July 16th, the same morning the Trinity test detonated in the New Mexico desert, proving that atomic weapons were real and terrible. A convoy of trucks arrived at Mare Island under heavy guard. Sailors watched as wooden crates were loaded aboard, some small enough for 2 men to carry, others requiring cranes and careful handling. One cylindrical canister stood nearly 15 feet tall and was secured with unusual care in the hangar deck. No one told the crew what they were carrying. The crates were sealed, locked, and placed under armed guard. Even Captain McVeigh was not fully briefed on the contents, only that they were of supreme importance, that speed was essential, and that the ship would sail without escort, a highly unusual and dangerous proposition given that Japanese submarines still prowled the Pacific. The Indianapolis departed San Francisco on the 16th of July, passing beneath the Golden Gate Bridge and into the open ocean with a crew of nearly 1,200 men and cargo that would change the world. The ship ran at flank speed, her engines driving her through the swells at nearly 30 knots, faster than she had ever sustained for such a distance. The weather held, the sea remained relatively calm, and the Indianapolis covered distances that seemed impossible, racing westward across the Pacific as if pursued by demons. The crew speculated endlessly about their cargo and destination. Some thought they carried parts for a new secret weapon. Others guessed they were delivering gold or documents. A few joked that they were hauling Clark Gable's personal effects. Nobody guessed the truth. On July 26th, 10 days and 3,300 nautical miles after leaving California, the Indianapolis arrived at Tinian, her record-breaking crossing complete. Cranes unloaded the crates. Armed guards escorted them to secure facilities. Captain McVeigh received brief thanks and new orders. Proceed to Guam, then to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines for training exercises. The Indianapolis departed Tinian on July 28th, her mission accomplished, her crew relieved that whatever they had carried was someone else's responsibility now. On Tinian, in the days following the Indianapolis's arrival, the final assembly of Little Boy proceeded with painstaking care. Scientists from the Manhattan Project's Project Alberta team worked in the air-conditioned assembly building, manipulating the uranium components with hands that trembled slightly despite years of training, knowing that a mistake could trigger uncontrolled reactions or, worse, ruin the weapon entirely. The uranium target rings and projectile were fitted into the bomb casing, a blunt cylinder 10 feet long and 29 inches in diameter, painted matte black and grotesquely heavy. Electrical systems were installed, fusing mechanisms tested and retested, safety plugs inserted that would remain in place until the bomber was airborne and approaching enemy territory. Outside the assembly hut, B-29s underwent their own preparations. The Enola Gay, named by Tibbets for his mother, received special modifications, reinforced bomb bay, new release mechanisms, pressurization adjustments. The crew trained relentlessly, flying practice runs over the Pacific, dropping pumpkin bombs, dummy weapons with the same ballistics as the real thing, on bypassed Japanese islands to perfect their technique. The atmosphere on Tinian in late July was electric with tension and anticipation, though still only a few dozen people understood what was coming, understood that within days, a single airplane would take off from this coral island carrying a weapon that would vaporize a city and announce to the world that humanity had finally learned to split the atom and harness the fires of the sun. Meanwhile, the USS Indianapolis sailed on toward her fate. After a brief stop at Guam, she departed on July 28th for Leyte Gulf, steaming independently without escort, following a route designated by naval planners as safe, though safe in wartime was always relative. The ship's crew settled into routine watches. The weather remained fair. The Pacific stretched in every direction, empty and vast beneath tropical stars. Captain McVeigh ran a zigzag pattern during daylight hours, a standard anti-submarine tactic, but at night he ceased zigzagging due to poor visibility and following standard practice. The Indianapolis was hardly alone in these waters. Allied shipping moved constantly between bases, but she was alone in being unescorted, alone in carrying no particular strategic importance now that her secret cargo had been delivered, alone in ways that would soon prove fatal. On the night of July 30th, the cruiser sailed through calm seas roughly halfway between Guam and Leyte, cutting through phosphorescent water under a moonless sky. Most of the crew slept in their bunks below decks, exhausted from the heat and the watches, trusting in the ship's size and speed and the protection of the darkness. On the bridge, officers maintained their watch, scanning the horizon with binoculars, seeing nothing but blackness and stars. Beneath the surface, Commander Makitsura Hashimoto commanded the Japanese submarine I-58, a large fleet submarine armed with torpedoes and Kaiten, human-guided suicide torpedoes that were essentially underwater kamikaze weapons. Hashimoto had been on patrol for weeks, hunting American shipping with limited success. The war was clearly lost, Tokyo was burning, But Japanese submariners continued their missions with the discipline and determination that defined the Imperial Navy even in defeat. Shortly before midnight on July 30th, I-58 surfaced to recharge batteries and ventilate, and Hashimoto scanned the horizon through his periscope. What he saw made his pulse quicken. A dark shape against the stars, a large ship moving at good speed, silhouetted by starlight, alone and unescorted. It was a target beyond his expectations, perhaps a battleship or heavy cruiser, a prize worthy of his remaining torpedoes. Hashimoto ordered his crew to battle stations, maneuvering the submarine into attack position with practiced efficiency. He could not believe his fortune. At 12 minutes past midnight on July 31st, Hashimoto gave the order to fire. 6 Type 95 torpedoes launched from I-58's tubes, their compressed air propulsion driving them through the dark water at 48 knots, their warheads armed, their guidance systems tracking toward the unsuspecting cruiser. 2 torpedoes found their mark. The first struck the Indianapolis on her starboard bow just below the waterline, the explosion tearing through steel plate and into the forward fuel tanks and ammunition magazine. The second torpedo hit amidships, demolishing a fire room and rupturing fuel lines. The explosions were catastrophic, lifting men from their bunks, shattering bulkheads, igniting fires, flooding compartments with seawater and burning oil. The bow section twisted and began to sink almost immediately. Men trapped below decks drowned in darkness, clawing at jammed hatches, their screams swallowed by rushing water. The ship's electrical system failed, plunging everything into blackness except for the orange glow of fires. The Indianapolis listed heavily to starboard, her keel breaking, her structural integrity destroyed. On the bridge, Captain McVeigh tried to assess the damage, tried to issue orders, but communications were gone. The engine rooms were flooding, and the ship was dying beneath his feet. 12 minutes after the torpedo struck, the USS Indianapolis rolled completely over and slid beneath the surface, her propellers still turning as she descended into the deep, carrying 300 men down with her. Men who never had a chance to escape, who died in the flooding compartments or were pulled down by the suction of the sinking ship. Roughly 900 men made it into the water, but their ordeal was only beginning. The Indianapolis had sunk so quickly that no distress call was sent, no SOS transmitted, no emergency position reported. The survivors floated in the dark Pacific wearing life jackets or clinging to debris, coated in thick black fuel oil that burned their eyes and throats, surrounded by the moans of wounded men and the crackle of floating fires. Some groups clustered around rafts or floating nets. Others drifted alone, already disoriented, already beginning the slow process of dying from exposure and dehydration. When dawn came, the sun rose over a scene of biblical horror. Hundreds of men scattered across miles of ocean, their faces blackened with oil, their skin already reddening from sun exposure, the water around them flat and glittering and indifferent. The tropical sun climbed higher and became a torch, scorching exposed skin, baking brains inside skulls, driving body temperatures to deadly levels. Men's lips cracked and bled. Their tongues swelled. The salt water that surrounded them in infinite abundance mocked them with thirst. Some men drank seawater despite warnings from their companions, and the salt poisoned them, accelerating dehydration, triggering hallucinations and kidney failure. By the second day, the hallucinations began in earnest. Men saw the Indianapolis floating just beneath them, fully intact, her decks visible through the clear water, and they tried to swim down to reach her, pulling off their life jackets and diving, never to surface again. Others saw land, green islands with palm trees and fresh water, and swam toward mirages until exhaustion claimed them. Some believed they were back home, talking to wives and mothers who weren't there, arguing with phantoms, descending into madness while their companions watched helplessly. The heat was relentless. Men vomited seawater they had drunk, fouling the water around them. Wounds from the explosions became infected. The strongest swimmers tried to hold groups together, to maintain morale, to enforce discipline, but their authority eroded as men succumbed to thirst and sun and despair. And then came the sharks. The explosions and the blood and the thrashing of hundreds of men had attracted them from miles away, drawn by vibrations and chemical signatures that meant wounded prey. They circled below, dark shapes moving through blue water, growing bolder as the hours passed. At first they took the dead, dragging corpses down into the depths. Then they took the dying, men who had drifted away from groups, who floated alone and helpless. Then they began attacking the living. The first attack sent shock waves of terror through the survivors. A man would scream, would thrash violently, would disappear beneath the surface in a boil of red water, and the others would kick and shout and cluster together, knowing that their movements might attract more sharks but unable to float passively while death circled below. The attacks continued throughout the days and nights, sometimes isolated incidents, sometimes frenzies when multiple sharks attacked simultaneously. Men watched their companions taken, watched them torn apart, watched the water turn crimson, and felt their sanity fraying. Some survivors later estimated that sharks killed dozens of men, perhaps more, though in the chaos and madness it was impossible to know for certain. Others died from exposure and dehydration and simply slipped beneath the surface, their bodies claimed by the ocean. The groups grew smaller, the living fewer, the hope dimmer. For 4 days, the survivors floated in hell while no one searched for them. The Indianapolis had not been expected at Leyte Gulf until July 31st, and when she failed to arrive, Naval Command assumed she had been delayed. Communication breakdowns and bureaucratic failures meant that no alarm was raised, no search initiated. The survivors drifted westward on the currents, scattered over dozens of miles, their numbers dwindling with each passing hour. On August 2nd, some groups were nearly dead, dehydrated beyond recovery, sunburned to the point of organ failure, mentally broken by days of terror and hallucination. Then, in the late morning, a Navy Ventura bomber on routine patrol spotted an oil slick. The pilot, Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn, investigated and saw something that made him radio immediately. Men in the water, hundreds of them, scattered across miles of ocean. Within hours, a PBY Catalina flying boat piloted by Lieutenant Adrian Marks arrived on scene, saw the desperation of the survivors and the sharks still circling, and made a decision that violated direct orders but saved lives. He landed his aircraft on the open ocean, taxied among the survivors, and began pulling men from the water, loading his plane beyond capacity, lashing men to the wings when the fuselage was full. Other rescue ships arrived through the night and the following day, pulling survivors from the water with cargo nets and ropes, wrapping them in blankets, administering water drop by drop to men whose throats were too swollen to swallow. Of the nearly 1,200 men who sailed from California aboard the USS Indianapolis, only 316 survived. 879 men died, in the initial sinking in the water, from exposure and dehydration and shark attacks and madness. It was the greatest single loss of life at sea in United States Navy history, a catastrophe made more bitter by the knowledge that the ship had already completed her mission, that the uranium she carried to Tinian had been assembled into Little Boy, that on August 6th, just days after the Indianapolis went down, the Enola Gay would take off from Tinian's North Field and fly to Hiroshima carrying that same uranium in a weapon that would detonate at 1,800 feet above the city and kill 80,000 people in an instant and end the war within days. The men who died in the Pacific never knew that their final mission had succeeded beyond measure, that they had delivered the instrument of Japan's surrender, that their suffering and death were the last major naval casualties of the Second World War. Captain McVeigh survived and was later court-martialed for failing to zigzag, a decision that haunted him for the rest of his life until he took his own life in 1968. Commander Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander who fired the torpedoes, testified at McVeigh's court-martial that zigzagging would likely have made no difference, but the verdict stood. The survivors carried their trauma forever, many suffering nightmares and psychological wounds that never healed, gathering each year to remember the shipmates who died in the dark water, while sharks circled and the sun blazed and hope faded hour by hour beneath the vast, indifferent sky. Tinian remained operational until the war's end, launching missions that burned Japanese cities to cinders, but its most important mission had already been completed when the Indianapolis arrived with her secret cargo in late July. The island today is quiet again, its runways cracked and overgrown, its bomb pits filled with rainwater, its memory preserved only in the minds of historians and the few remaining survivors who remember when it was the busiest airport in the world and the launching point for atomic fire. The story of Tinian and the Indianapolis remains one of history's cruelest ironies. A mission so successful it helped end the most terrible war humanity had ever known, followed immediately by a tragedy that killed hundreds of men who never learned their sacrifice had mattered, who died believing they were simply unlucky casualties of a war that seemed endless, who floated in darkness wondering if anyone would ever find them, or if the ocean would simply swallow them and their story forever.